not only have you got all the reasons why startups could fail, but you add on top of that all the political challenges of a corporate, and then on top again all the political challenges of being in one of those firms. It was just so frustrating. So we kind of got to the point where we had a handful of good customers and reference cases.
And we should probably name drop a few of those.
Sure.
Say Microsoft, LinkedIn, some other names that you can probably rattle off. You actually built the software twice over?
Actually 3 times in the end.
3 times.
So I am now starting to work on my own startup again.
Awesome.
Ridiculous as it might feel at times.
Welcome to Not the Rob Bell Podcast, where we talk with business owners, marketers, and professionals to extract what makes people and businesses successful.
Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Not the Rob Bell Podcast. Today's guest, I've got Faith Forster. She cut her teeth with the big multinationals, started her own VC-backed tech company, and now she's helping startup founders while working on her brand new venture herself. It's coming up now. So Faith Forster, thank you so much for coming to have a chat today. It's really great to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I understand that you're a bit of a trailblazer in some regards, but pretty entrenched in the Sydney startup industry and obviously the Australian startup scene. But before we get to some of that, can I learn a little bit about where you've been and how you sort of came to do what you do now?
Sure. Yeah, it's a bit of a windy journey actually. So for the interesting bits anyway, the last 10 years I was a management consultant here in Australia and then moved to London right as the financial crisis hit and started working for PwC there. So that was a very interesting time to be working for one of the big companies there because the access you got to projects was insane. So literally as soon as I landed in London, I was sent up to the Lehman Brothers administration.
Wow.
To work on there. That was actually really surreal walking into their office for the first time. It was the closest thing you'll ever find to a corporate refugee camp. It's just
interesting.
The sense in the office was just surreal. I also did some other crazy projects. So I worked with one of the board members at RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland, who were one of the naughty guys. I guess they got the biggest bailout from the UK government. So I worked with the board member responsible for risk, trying to help them work out what they needed to do differently. I also worked for BP after the Gulf of Mexico crisis, trying to centralise their decision-making and processes. I spent 9 months working on a project in Iraq, setting up new operations out there, which is actually one of my favourite projects I ever did. Until Sandy, my husband, told me that he fretted every time I went out there, and so I had to give it up after that. But yeah, so did some really amazing stuff. There was, I kind of got to the point where there wasn't a lot I hadn't seen. I kind of felt like I had ticked that box. I'm someone who I need to be constantly learning. So I kind of got to the point where I was just getting a bit bored. And so I had my first baby, Archie, and then started my own startup. And that came from a couple of things, I guess, trying to do these sort of crazy transformation programs. So if you take RBS as an example, they had 5,000 people globally in their risk function who we needed to help work in a very fundamentally different way. And so trying to engage that number of people right across the globe so that they actually chose to behave in a different way was literally impossible. Using spreadsheets and email and PowerPoint slides and things. And my husband, Sandy, at the time was working for Yammer, which was the big sort of buzzwave around collaboration.
Yep.
I thought that was really exciting, that I could really see the power in that. But I thought, wouldn't it be great if we took that concept but gave it some structure so that people could collaborate to actually get stuff done rather than collaborating for collaborating's sake. And so that's what we did with our startup. It was called Kpmg. It was kind of like Trello, if you're familiar with that. So really, it's a project management tool, but really, really simple, really visual. You didn't have to be a project management expert to know what was going on. But it was designed for corporate type projects, what we called strategic initiatives. So where there's lots of stakeholders, multiple work streams, so it's a bit more complex.
So can we chat about Kpmg for a little bit? And I think a lot of us are used to as you say, like Trello, Asana, some of those project management tools that are there. Some of those we use ourselves. But you were more focused around trying to bridge the gap between different departments in very large organisations, if I'm getting that correct?
Yeah.
And so that was really born from the experience of working with some of these world's biggest companies.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
And so during that journey, what was the opportunity, or like where was that moment where you sort of found yourself thinking, this can be done better and I have to make this happen?
The idea that this could be done better came from the fact that my husband was working at Yammer. So clearly he and the team there were massive advocates of this idea of collaborative working.
And I know a little bit about Yammer, but it's probably more like a cross between Twitter and Slack maybe right now. Is that we never used it, but we were involved with it.
So the original positioning for Yammer was basically Facebook for business. So it's kind of trying to bring that social element into a work environment. I think where it was quite challenging for them to get the engagement they needed on the platform is you need a reason to collaborate. There has to be some sort of purpose around it. And so having just this stream of stuff that hopefully people post in and maybe respond to without purpose around my day job and what I actually need to do as part of my job was a little bit challenging, which is hence why they really became strong advocates for this idea of kind of more collaborative working in general.
Sure.
I think tools that have come out since, like Slack and Teams, and they kind of recognise that actually it works better if it's around a team that has a purpose to get a job done. And so people collaborate for that purpose, and that may be an ongoing purpose, or it may be something like a project where it has a finite period of time.
So it's more about objectives and outcomes and project purpose, as opposed to just here's a collaboration tool, go collaborate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so that was where we were trying to give it a little bit of structure to help you actually deliver an outcome. But the scenarios that we were dealing with, you could have hundreds through to thousands of people who were interested in what it is you were trying to achieve. And so the normal structure you have around projects like that is the project team does all this work, and they might run some workshops, they might do some communications to let people who are going to have their jobs changed as a result, let them know about it, or maybe give them an opportunity to ask some questions. But it really is the project team, creating something and then throwing it over the fence. So the idea of what we were trying to do is kind of make that something that's more collaborative in nature and visible in general, so that anyone who's interested in what the project's doing has the opportunity to see and contribute at any time. And it becomes more of an ongoing sort of organic flow and sharing of ideas and trying to work together to achieve the outcome, rather than this whole us versus them thing between the project team and everyone else whose jobs it was going to impact on.
Sure. Did you see a lot of, when you were working in these big companies post-GFC, which were basically in tatters as a result, did you see real clear evidence of a lack of collaboration and communication? Is that, or was this just trying to solve a business challenge that maybe had a part in those GFC problems, but would help make better companies in the future?
I think it's always been, there's always been a good intent, and there's fields like change management, which was my background, whose job it was to help make sure that was the case, that they were talking to people and engaging them and trying to understand what this meant for them and bring them on that journey. I just felt like the tools they had available at their disposal to do that were really limited. Like creating PowerPoint decks, by nature, that's a one-way process. People would go into a meeting saying, we want this to be collaborative, please ask questions, but then they'd talk at them for 40 minutes. And so it's kind of like, well, actually, if you had a tool where, the thinking and it was more visible to more people, that could make a big difference. And actually genuinely working in a collaborative way rather than just saying it before a meeting or whatever.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Because I think when we think around, multi-level communication and culture in particular, we really think about startups and the Google stereotype of communal meals and slides down the escalators. But like, how important is getting that communication and that culture right in these bigger companies, especially in a change management sort of scenario?
I personally think it's very important. That was, I guess, why I was in that field. I think companies vary in the level to which they appreciate that that's important. One of the things I used to say when I was in the field was, the way you change then sets the tone for how you're going to operate or work in the new structure or the new world that you've created. So how you manage that situation through that change is really important to then reset the culture afterwards. But that, often that wasn't necessarily what the priority was at the time.
Sure.
So I think that's something that I guess having had the experiences I've had since and running my own business and things, I think it is important to kind of have a realistic understanding of actually, what's the business driver behind this? What are you actually trying to achieve? What are the priorities? Because you can't do everything and do everything well. And using that to then make a better assessment about actually how much do you invest or, what type of tools do you leverage or things
Sure.
to do that. Yeah.
And so obviously that's helping drive the purpose and the idea behind Pinnaper. What was, I know it was VC backed to get, was that a seed round or a Series A round? Can you give us a little bit of understanding around how that process happened?
Yeah, sure. We were VC backed. That was our seed round. So we kind of got to the point where we had a handful of good customers and reference cases.
And we should probably name drop a few of those.
Sure.
Say Microsoft, LinkedIn, some other names that you can probably rattle off.
Yeah. They came after the seed round actually. But so at the seed round we had Cancer Research UK, we had National Grid, we had one of the retail chains in the UK, one of the local governments or local authorities. So we had, and we were also talking to American Express at the time, but that in the end that got blocked for security reasons.
Sure.
Some really great customers at the time we were raising investment. After the investment, we then also had Microsoft, LinkedIn, NHS, GlaxoSmithKline, PwC, Capita, a few others.
No small feat in its own right.
Yeah, it helps, I think, when you're in a place like London where a lot of those companies are headquartered or have big presence.
Sure.
We definitely did well in terms of credibility from a customer perspective. But in terms of raising our investment, we had largely funded it ourselves, and it kind of got to the point where my husband Sandy was my co-founder, so we were both now working on it full time to have gotten those customers on board and to be supporting them, and really needed to be able to pay ourselves.
Sure.
And so we did raise money. In terms of that process, it wasn't something I'd ever done before, and so I guess in creating a tech company, I knew that was something we would have to consider at some point. And so I'd made the effort to really learn about how that process worked and things we needed to be aware of from pretty early on in creating the company. It is raising money like that in the tech scene is very much an exercise in networking. So it does take 6 months to raise money. It takes that long to sort of get around and meet all the right people and build a relationship and demonstrate that you're actually delivering against something, that you're making progress. And it's not something you should do lightly. Like you don't want to raise money until you absolutely have to, because it costs you money effectively out of the business. You're giving away ownership in your business. Sure. But also the longer you can wait, the further along you can get the business, the better valuation you're going to get. So you'll get more money for the same percentage of your business, or you'll give away less of your business for the same amount. But yeah, certainly with our fundraising, because I was a female founder at the time, there was very few female investors, and I had a child. This has started as my maternity leave project.
Sure.
And so it was really important to me to have an investor that understood what it meant to be a parent. and that this was something that needed to work around that, particularly when it was a husband and wife team. And there was one prominent investor in London at the time, Eileen, from Passion Capital, who had 4 children, and so I specifically wanted her as my investor. And so every one I met, I said to him, "Can you introduce me to Eileen? Can you introduce me to Eileen?" I finally came across someone who's like, "Yeah, I spoke to her last week. I'm happy to do an intro." And so I met her, and she became our non-exec director, our lead investor, and then had other angel investors come along as well. But Eileen is very, very prominent in the London tech scene. So she was on David Cameron's business advisory group. She still does work for tech, for the Treasury in the UK, and the Mayor of London, sort of promoting the tech scene globally. She's been called the Queen of Tech, but she's amazing. I love her. The guys would tease me that I had a womance instead of a bromance.
I haven't heard that term, but I really do like it.
Yeah, she was awesome, and that really mattered at later stages in the company, because with tech businesses, like, things absolutely will go wrong without a doubt. And I knew that she had my back 100%. And particularly later on, when I found out I was pregnant with the twins, I rang her, like, I was devastated. I was just like, oh my God, the worst thing in the world has happened. And she's like, "That's amazing." And I'm like, no, but it's twins. And she's like, "Don't worry, we'll get through this. We'll work it out."
So how important is it, I think, when the uninitiated, such as myself, when it comes to venture capital, think you'd basically cast a wide net and try and get money from anywhere. But I think you're demonstrating how important it is to know who you want to invest as much as you want to demonstrate in return.
Absolutely. It's like getting married. Yeah. You have to be really, really careful about who you bring on as your investors, because they're going to be on that journey with you for a while, and it's not going to be a smooth journey.
And obviously you were married to your co-founder, Sandy.
Yeah.
How does that play in as well if you have investors and co-founders? Is there a magic nugget for finding some synergy there?
I think so I was part of a network of female founders in London that Eileen kind of introduced me into. So there was a lot of very successful women running tech businesses, like some were unicorns already and had done exceptionally well. And a few of us had dinner one night, and 2 of us, interestingly, were both Australian and both had co-founders that were our partners or husbands, and the other 2 weren't Australian, which would be expected in London. But we had this sort of interesting conversation where the other 2 were like, "There is just no way I could work with my husband or partner. Like, it just would never happen. Like, it would be a disaster." Whereas for myself and the other lady, it was like, well, you need your business partner. Again, it's like getting married. Like, you need to have absolute trust in that person. And I couldn't think of a better person to do it other than my husband. And it just so happened we had really complementary skills that really worked in that situation.
And so that's certainly going to help, no doubt, when there's slightly different and complementary skill sets, because does that help retain a bit of a divide line down the middle?
Yeah, it does. It does. It was like I started a tech company with no tech background. Like, it was a crazy thing to do. And so having him who knew tech was my safety net.
Sure.
So that was really important. But it does have other implications in that it does make it harder to switch off at times. It's kind of convenient as well, because you can have chat over the dinner table and nut out some problems that you need to.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest thing for me was the risk that we took on as a family, and that we were both not working, trying to get this business going. We still had to pay mortgage. We still had to pay daycare fees. And when things were sort of a bit rocky with the business, it's not just the business that's on the line, it's your personal financial situation as well.
Of course.
So that put a lot of pressure on.
And so I understand, from the understanding I've got of Kpmg and some of it, maybe even your own words that described it, but you actually built the software twice over?
Actually 3 times in the
3 times. Can you give us a bit of an insight into how that came about?
So we actually had a third co-founder early on. I sort of put together some user stories and some screenshots in PowerPoint of what I wanted and asked some guys about building it. And they came back saying it's going to cost X amount. And I was like, look, there's no way we can pay that kind of money. Like at most it would be half that.
Yep.
And they're like, oh, that's okay. We can do it for half. And I was like,
That was easy.
clearly I haven't articulated what I need well enough here, because you don't just halve it. And so we then kind of put the project on ice until I actually went to a startup tech conference and met Charlie, who became our third co-founder, because I felt like I needed someone who could translate. So Sandy, my husband, has a tech background, but he's in sales, so he couldn't tell developers what to do.
Sure.
So I felt like we needed someone who could kind of translate that. When Charlie came on board, he was still working full time, and so we outsourced it to some guys in India, and that worked really reasonably well, and then it got us to our first customer. But we were trying to work out, knowing what I know now, we went about it all the wrong way. We were trying to work out what we were building as we were building it. So the product we ended up with was a mess. And so we then brought on our own sort of back-end developer, and it was easier for him to start again than
Sure.
to try and work through their code. And so that was the second time. But even at that point, we still only had one customer using it, and so we still hadn't properly validated what the product needed to do.
Yep.
And so we built it again much better this time, and it looked much better as well. We brought on our own designer and stuff. But again, it was only sort of later in that journey I discovered what UX, user experience, is. This is all quite a few years ago, before this stuff was so well known.
Yeah.
And so by that stage we had 6 or so customers that had actually used it for full projects, and we had a lot of feedback that had come back. And so we took that on board and redesigned the product again. And I had kind of agreed to a front end redesign, but as it turned out, the guys ended up basically rebuilding the whole thing again. Which actually caused a lot of pain, because it took far longer than we expected, and cut right into the sales period for the year. And so it basically put us in, this was just after we'd raised the money, it put us under a lot of financial pressure.
Sure.
To get the sales next year.
And because I think people assume when you've raised some money, regardless of a seed round or getting further into it, that it's basically, you can do whatever you like and just focus on it and get it done. But can you riff on that a little bit? The business still must go on. This is just a springboard.
Yeah. So when you raise money in the tech world, you're generally raising for 18 months. So you work out what your cost base is going to be to do what you think you need to do to build the business in that 18 months, and that's how much you raise. For us, there's a lot of things I would have done differently in hindsight, but I think generally things take you twice as long to achieve what you want to achieve anyway. But when you then add into that an enterprise sales cycle, which is at best 6 months,
Yep.
That becomes really difficult. So actually trying to, because you have certain expectations of sales or revenue that you're going to hit, at the end of that 18 months, to be ready for a Series A stage, it's all about your numbers. And so we needed to be getting revenues that were kind of up towards the $1 million mark to be able to raise a Series A round off
Sure.
the back of that. And so rebuilding the product takes out a big chunk of the time that you'll want to be selling to be able to get up to those kind of numbers. So you still need to perform as a business. I think that's one of the difficulties around the tech startup scene. Certainly what I saw in London, I think Australia's better, is that it is a business. You are building a business. It's not, a game.
And it's not just money for nothing. You need to produce tangible results.
Absolutely.
And so, it sounds like you approached it in a really considered way, with sort of a minimum viable product, get it to market, rather than spend, years designing the letter perfect version. When did you realise that maybe that first version wasn't going to get you that next round of sales that you wanted to get?
The first version was more a judgment on the amount of effort it would take for us to do what we wanted to do with it from then versus start again. So it was kind of the tech debt that we had accumulated just because of the way that we'd gone about designing and building the product was just too much, basically.
Sure.
So that's why we started again.
So is that why would you classify that as almost like a mini pivot in terms of the software itself? Sort of, was it a ground up?
I think that I wouldn't redesigning the product. I wouldn't call a pivot. I think the pivot is more around your purpose and focus and who you're selling to. Yeah, I think it was just a judgment call at that point around could we get to where we want to go next with this as our base.
So just kind of wouldn't serve out those future plans, and you'd ultimately it was a do it now or find yourself having to do it again later with even more cost.
Or even like what we wanted to do now would take us at least 3 times as long. So do we just cut our losses and start again, or do we keep trying to persevere?
Sure.
Yeah.
And so when sort of Pinnaper came to the end of that road, was there did you have a realization there that maybe it wasn't going to pan out as the hopes and dreams had said it was going to?
It was definitely, when we rebuilt it the third time, and that really ate into our sales period. Because I should explain, in the UK, because the summer's in the middle of the year, it creates really distinct sales cycles. So basically nothing happens in July and August.
Sure.
So you have to sell by July, or wait until the next year, because by the time everyone comes back from holidays in September, they're just trying to finish things off before Christmas. So you've only got February through to July basically to sell. And so we were supposed to release the new product in February. It ended up not being ready until May. So that year's sales were gone for us,
sure.
Which meant we had one more window to get the sales we needed to position ourselves for another investment round. And that was, I think I found out I was pregnant in October for the next sales cycle. So that so it was kind of oh my God, how's this going to work kind of situation. But we were already cutting costs and stuff, trying to sort of extend our runway anyway, knowing that we were in this sort of position. But that was when I had this conversation with my investors. And we did a few things which I think were fundamentally important, and things I regularly advise other startups on now. So it took us too long to find product market fit, mainly because even though we had all these great name customers, they were so varied in what they were doing, like local governments versus retail versus utility companies, or tech companies, their needs were quite different,
sure.
which was giving us a bit of difficulty trying to work out where to prioritize our focus for the product. And so we went through an exercise called the ideal customer profile, where we looked at all of our different potential customer segments and prioritized them based on propensity to purchase and the product market fit. And out of that, we decided the consultancies were our best target, because they, in terms of managing stakeholders and managing these big complex projects, they kind of knew that problem better than anyone. But we couldn't have really targeted them to start with, because we needed proof before they would work with us.
Sure.
But yeah, so we decided to focus on consultancies. Again, we did reasonably well. It was much better having that narrow focus. You then had, a proper list of target customers that you could go after, and it was a space that I knew pretty well anyway. So that worked really well for us. We talked to all the majors. We had pilots sort of in the pipeline with all of them, or almost all of them. We had 2 enterprise deals on the table with ones that had used it and got a lot of value out of it. So that was kind of coming into March the next year.
Sure.
And so I had spoken to my investor and said, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to focus here. We're doing these things with the product. We need to get this revenue by July. Basically, this is do or die, basically.
Yep.
Either it'll work and it would go great, or it won't, and so be it. And she was like, yep, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. And this was when I just found out I was pregnant with the twins, and she sort of stopped me and she's like, you don't have to do this. I sort of looked at her, what do you mean? And she's like, if you want to just walk away, that's okay. Which is that shows the value of having a female investor. And I was like, no way. Like we've gone through all this pain and gone through all this effort to get ourselves in this position. Like there is no way that I want to give up at this point, not know whether or not it could have worked.
Sure.
And so she was like, yep, fine, go for it. Like, so that was actually a really great conversation to have, because like I was then 100% committed, and we did everything we could to make that work.
Yep.
And it was looking really good. Like in March the next year, our investors actually gave us a bit more money to make sure I had the right team in place to cover me while I took some time off with the twins. But then Theresa May decided to call a snap election and basically destroyed it all for us. Because consultancies in particular, because that came out of the blue, no one was expecting it. And so the consultancies, a lot of their revenue comes from government, which then shuts down through the election period. And so they just clamped down on any costs. So all of those deals went off the table.
And there's no way to predict that kind of external factor, right? No amount of preparation is ever going to cater for something like that.
No. It's a bit like COVID now. But, so that again killed the year's sales for us. And so we did have a bit of money. Like we had been quite smart in trying to manage our costs and things. So in theory, like we could have cut back further and maybe gone another year and seen where it went. But I was done emotionally. Like I was just burnt out and I was done, and I had twin babies and
of course.
And
so ultimately you made the call and you found yourself back in Australia. And I understand that you fired off KPMG Upstarts as a founder. Can you, some of us will know the KPMG brand. Can you give us an understanding of how that comes about when it's, say, partnered with a global consultancy?
Yeah. Well, an accounting firm as well at that. Actually, as I went around and did different talks, people would come up to me and say, I just can't believe an accounting firm would be doing this kind of thing. And I said, well, actually, the accounting part of the business is only 20% now. Like what those firms do is so much greater than just numbers, audits and tax and things. So that came about. I got back to Australia and sort of had coffee with anyone who would talk to me. And so I said, look, this is me. This is what I've done. Where do I fit in this market, basically? And I knew consultancies. I knew that world. And I kind of figured for the type of work I do at my level, it would be a big investment for one business to take on someone like me to do that, whereas that risk can be spread, I guess, when you're working in one of those firms.
Sure.
And so I was chatting to I spoke to most of those firms actually, but with KPMG, Ken, who became my sort of big boss, I had a chat with him, and we just had this really great conversation. They'd sort of told me that these are the sort of things they do in innovation, and they kind of looked at me and said, look, if the right person came along, we've got this idea, we'd do it if the right person was there. And so they said, look, let me have a chat and come back. And so they messaged me a few days later saying, come in and meet Ken. And I was like, yeah, that's fine, but what are we talking about? And so they said, look, we'd like to set up a competitor to BCG Digital Ventures, basically. So work with corporates to help them build new products as a way of driving new sources of revenue. And I love what BCG Digital Ventures do. It's amazing. I was like freaked out about the idea of me actually starting something like that. Like, are you crazy? And so my way of reacting to that was just to ask a whole bunch of questions. And it wasn't the very last question I asked was, where does this sit in the business? Is it part of consulting or somewhere different? And they said, oh, no, we should probably explain that it's actually in a separate part of the business. It's our investment centre, so we give things 3 years until we decide whether or not they're viable. And that was the difference for me. It's kind of like, if I had that time to build it as a business, then I was like, yes, I can do that. But if I was going to be given like tough revenue targets from day one, then like something like that needed investment.
Sure.
And so that was what got me excited about it, basically. And then having had that conversation with Ken, I basically interviewed him. I was like, you realise you're going to have to do this and this and this and this. And he's like, yep, we know. It's okay. We can do it. And I'm like, okay, well, let's go for it.
Well, it's essentially like interviewing an investor all over again, right?
Yeah, I suppose, because you're investing your time and your career. And It's an important decision, I think, to make about where you take steps in your career.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so during that phase and over the last few years, you've become a real entrenched member of the startup community in Australia. How much has that corporate experience and even the time with KPMG played into how you advise and mentor startups?
Actually, I haven't been as entrenched in the Sydney startup scene as I would like, mainly because I was busy with my job at Kpmg and we were working with corporates.
Sure.
So I made the effort to take on some mentor roles with Stone and Chalk for financial services and also tech-ready women who help female founders that are just starting out and non-tech female founders in particular, which was my background.
Sure.
So I think the experience of trying to work with the corporates I found quite challenging, and that not only have you got all the reasons why startups could fail, but you add on top of that all the political challenges of a corporate, and then on top again all the political challenges of being in one of those firms, and it was just so frustrating, and then every angle. So we did some great projects across a number of different sectors. But in the end, I just kind of felt like the value that you got from trying to work with those companies outweighed the benefit of actually kind of trying to get some new products launched and into market and work in a sort of agile way, basically. So,
Sure.
So I kind of took the opportunity to take a redundancy when it came up. But yeah, in terms of advising startups, I love it. I really do love it. Whenever I've had the opportunity, either in my capacity at KPMG or in some of the personal voluntary type roles I've done, it's hard to explain, but when you've been around the block a few times and you've got the scars on your back, you just have this innate sense of kind of going, oh, you ask a few questions and kind of go, oh, that's your hotspot. Have you thought about that? And in the startup scene, there are a lot of, there's definitely a dark side to the startup scene. There's a lot of people who hang around who are trying to get equity or money for doing very little.
Sure. Yeah.
But then there's also, I had some of the most amazing advisors, and my business wouldn't have gotten to where it was without those people. And so I think that's really important if you have that experience and you can add that value to those companies that you do that, sort of pay it forward.
Because you mentioned Stone and Chalk, and for those who aren't familiar, my understanding is that it's a co-working space, but it also tries to bring together mentorship, investor, and like startup incubation.
Yes. Can
you explain a little bit, or is there evidence of like how well that can synergize and accelerate things?
It's been proven actually globally. So there has been a lot of research done on why certain cities, certain areas around the world have really thrived in their startup scene, and so there's a lot of evidence around the fact that having those support structures in place really helps. Having had a unicorn come out of that city before makes a huge difference as well, because you get all the implications around funding available and talent being available and stuff that comes from that. So it is, Stone and Chalk was kind of the first big step that Sydney or the New South Wales government took to create a startup scene and support network as a way of kind of trying to promote innovation. I think there are not many cities around the world now that don't recognise the need to, have a thriving tech sector.
Sure, yeah.
And that's a huge, huge growth lever for the economy in general. I think I saw some figures from Tech Nation in the UK that was adding to 17%. 17% of the growth in jobs was coming out of their startup scene, their tech sector.
Yeah, okay.
So it's an incredibly important part of the economy. It's something that does need to be taken seriously and well supported. I think Australia still has a way to go to be comparing to some of the other cities in the world in that respect. But there are some really positive things happening as well.
And because there's certainly no lack of ideas coming out of Australia.
Yeah.
I think it's really just how we incubate those and send them on their journey.
Yeah.
And is that what you see the value as a mentor and being involved in that startup scene? Is that where you find the value?
I I think the value for me is, like, I do genuinely get a buzz out of those conversations. I do genuinely love being able to help others who have been in the similar situation that I've been in, because I valued it so much. I think the startup scene in Australia is, some of the tech coming out of here is amazing because, unlike in the UK, and I think to a greater extent in the US, there is so much funding available and so much buzz around the tech scene that you have people building tech that doesn't really solve a problem. They're almost like they're solution looking for a problem.
Sure.
Whereas in Australia, because we haven't had the luxury of huge amounts of funding being available, a lot of the startups have had to bootstrap and fund themselves through revenue. And so they've had to have that really, really tight focus on solving a genuine problem from the start, which drives a better solution. So I think a lot of the products that are coming out in Australia, the startups that are doing well because they solve a genuine problem.
So there's almost a bit of natural selection in the idea before it gets to that stage.
Yeah, it's certainly not the only thing. There's a lot of things that can go wrong on that journey, as I told you from my story. But
Sure.
But it's really important to have that as a strong starting point.
And I think it's an important lesson in business of any age that, investment doesn't make everything automatic, and
No.
it still takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, market research, testing, trialing. Was there any unexpected lessons that came out of that process?
Of getting funding or my startup journey in general?
Either.
I think with funding, the points I made around it is like getting married. Like you need to really carefully select who your investors are and not just take money from anyone who'll give it to you is incredibly important. I know a very good friend of mine is a female founder up in Queensland, has taken some money from one of the prominent investors up there, and she's had a really difficult time with that investor. I think as women in particular, and the fact that you're probably going to have children at some point, you want investors who are very understanding of that situation and going to support you no matter what happens. I think from a business perspective, so I am now starting to work on my own startup again.
Awesome.
Ridiculous as it might feel at times. I've taken a lot of those lessons on board with the way I've approached it this time around. So being really clear around the problem that you're solving, we're still at very early stages, but
it doesn't even have a name yet.
No, it doesn't even have a name yet. But we have worked through our ideal customer profile. We've looked at our potential customer segments and prioritised those. I've just finished doing interviews with 5 customers out of each of those segments to help us refine what the problem is, what their needs are, the value proposition, and what the offering needs. And now we're using that to then work through our business model and starting to explore sort of the high priority areas that we know are critically important to make the whole thing succeed. And this actually isn't a tech proposition anyway, but all of that needs to be done before you even think about what the tech looks like, or in this situation, how you actually bring that offering to life.
And so there's some considerations that you've already had to make for a non-tech offering that were totally irrelevant for your previous tech venture?
I think, I'm keen to do this differently. So it's a retail offering. So we're looking to do...
I'm happy for you to go as deep into that as you like.
It is. So we're looking to create a plant-based whole food, franchise-based food chain, basically. So making plant-based food really, really easy, accessible and convenient so that more people choose to eat that way more often, whether it's from a sustainability sort of carbon impact perspective or for their own health. I think that, with the plant-based meats that are coming out, there's a huge amount of interest in this space. There's a lot of people who have heard of it and they have good intent, but they're busy and, their lives get in the way and this isn't their first priority. And so if you made it easy for them to try this food and see how to eat in this way, I think that would be really powerful.
And obviously you have some passion in this area, which I can tell from the way that you're talking about it. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to this idea in the first place?
Yeah, it largely came from my own health journey. So when I was pregnant with the twins, I had gestational diabetes and I've had problems since, basically. So it was 3 or 4 years of bouncing around the medical system in both the UK and Australia before working out what the actual problem was. But even then, the advice I've been given hasn't been particularly useful. They'll give you medication, but actually it's a lifestyle disease, and so you need to be thinking about your lifestyle.
Sure.
It was kind of by accident I came across the plant-based diet, and it was actually from an environmental perspective. We had an au pair actually that was living with us comment on how much meat we eat. And so we decided to get HelloFresh vegetarian as a way of reducing our red meat consumption and therefore our carbon impact. And I was just so surprised at how much better I felt.
Yep.
And as it turns out, red meat is actually not a good thing to eat if you're diabetic. And so that led me to then do a bit more research, and we watched Game Changers on Netflix and Fork Over Knives, which are the two things people tend to know about quickly, and got on to some of the guys in the US have just published a book called Mastering Diabetes, which talks about plant-based whole food diet as a way of reversing diabetes, which is incredible. And so I'm now on that diet. It's relatively new, but it does make a huge impact. But as I've spoken to people about that journey that I've been on now for almost 9 months of changing my diet, I've been amazed at how many other people are also trying to make steps. Like they might be choosing to eat vegetarian 1 or 2 nights a week, or it tends to be around meat first, but sometimes dairy as well.
Sure.
But they don't. There's also a lot of people who know about it, would like to do the right thing, but just don't really know how. So it's really just trying to help those people learn about what it means to eat in this way, what foods are available. The fact that it is actually still really great food that tastes amazing, but also helps the environment and your own health as well.
So obviously we're in the throes of COVID at the moment, and we've seen a huge upswing in meal delivery, meal preparation services, that sort of thing. How would you contrast what you're doing to those sorts of options?
Yeah, so we have thought quite carefully about the different options. There are some plant-based home delivery options available in Australia now. There are also some great brands being sold through the supermarkets. But when I did those interviews and I spoke to those people, there may have been 1 or 2 that had mentioned them, but generally not. Even though these are people who want to be trying this food, they want to be eating in this way, they just don't have the time and energy to do that research and find that out. And so I think it's really important to build a really strong brand around this that becomes synonymous with plant-based food. And to be, like, convenience is such a critical factor in this, I think. So I feel it's critically important to do the retail part first, to build that brand, make it convenient, help more people eat this type of food more often, and then you can then choose other options. But I feel like that by creating that retail presence, you'll actually drive the demand rather than hoping people find you somewhere in the supermarket.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And do you think, obviously we've seen some of the players such as the Beyond Burger and things start to make their way into the supermarket. Is that a really tech-driven solution because that distribution is easy? And like, have you deliberately stepped away from some of those that exist to start with a retail model?
I think there's actually, I saw an article recently, the demand for plant-based meats and plant-based foods generally has skyrocketed during COVID because people associate COVID and the impact that COVID's had with the fact that meat bats were being eaten in China, like the irresponsible consumption of meat. And so it's been one of the areas that has actually seen mega growth as a result of the COVID crisis. I think, like, borrowing our skills that we've done from a tech startup and applying it to this space, what we're trying to do is reinvent the whole retail experience and the supply chain. So one of the things that came out of those interviews that's incredibly important for people in this space is the packaging and making sure that that's sustainable. So one of the things that we're looking at is having 100% compostable packaging and then managing our own compost to create gardens where we grow our own herbs and potentially some of the vegetables and things that we use as well, and create that full circular economy within our own organisation.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Because I think it's one aspect of retail in particular that gets overlooked a little bit is the packaging and the waste. And is that something that you feel can set you apart, not just for the food, but for that entire footprint?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's things that we can do that then I would like to have a zero waste policy in general. So I think if there's things that we can do that demonstrates what's possible to other retailers, and if they then jump on board with that, that's an amazing thing for everyone. So things like there's a startup that's just come out that does digital receipts, but you can then use the data that's collected as part of that to understand the purchasing patterns of your customers better and have a mechanism to re-engage them beyond the transaction. So it makes good business sense, but actually you're also reducing 30,000 kilometres worth of paper that's used for receipts every year.
Of course, which all end up in the bin anyway.
Exactly. So yeah, I think there's just some, if you because we don't have a retail background, you're not starting with an existing template. You're starting from scratch and rethinking each part of the customer experience and working out how can we improve this in a way that's more sustainable.
And so you're not trying to bolt on an environmental initiative. It's really core to the business fundamentally.
Yeah, absolutely cool. Yeah.
Cool. I love it. So we're starting to come up on time, but is there anything about this new venture that you'd love to get on the floor that we haven't discussed already?
About my new venture, not at this stage.
Or anything else.
Yeah, we're not. If we had a name, then I could say follow us, but we're not quite there yet.
What's your runway for, or what's your time frame for getting this project off the ground?
So we're trying to time it with the social distancing measures being eased. So at this point, we're still working through the concept. We do need to work out a name very quickly because brand is such a critical part of the proposition.
Sure.
And the financials at the moment. And then we're going to start doing some pop-up stores and using that as a way to sort of test the menu and the experience.
Yep.
Which is interesting, because the feedback we've gotten is this would be great in the city or the inner city areas, but in the city at the moment it's really quiet. There's not many people going to the office. And that's probably going to have a lasting impact to some degree because I think working from home is going to be a lot more acceptable. So there's things about the model that we still need to wait and see a little bit. But we will test elements through pop-up stores and then look to open our first stores probably in the later part of this year.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
So I do have a couple of quick questions, and they do relate not just to your current or past ventures. It kind of crosses the gamut. If there was one piece of advice that stood out that you've had through your career, that you could pass on to someone looking at taking on venture capital or investment, what would that be?
One piece of advice. If you're specifically looking to take on venture capital, be very careful about who you take on as investors, without a doubt. But also I think one of the powerful things about my husband as my co-founder is I'm the visionary. I get very excited about these. I'm the ideas woman, I guess, and he's the cynical realist. And it's actually a really powerful combination in that sense because things will go wrong. They will not all go to plan. And so I think having that reality check built in to the way you're working and what your plans are and what you're doing is really important. Because once you do take on investment, it is added pressure for the business to perform. And so you need to be really open-eyed about what that means and the stress that's going to add to you as well.
Awesome. That's definitely good advice. And for a startup founder or a business owner who's looking to seek mentorship, is there some tips for selecting a mentor or mentors?
I think like everything, relationships are really important. You will naturally find, whether they have the mentor title or not, you'll naturally find people who you go to for trusted advice, just because the advice they're giving you is really valuable. I think it's so critically important when you do take on advice that you apply your own judgment. No one understands your business better than you do, and people can make these flippant comments that could have major ramifications. If you take those on board, like it could destroy your business. There are people who just don't think about what they're saying or don't understand the implications of that. So you do need to be really, really careful about what advice you actually listen to and take on board and act on.
Interesting. And along a similar vein, if someone was selecting a co-founder that they weren't married to and had complementary skills, is there anything that stands out that makes that work?
Yeah, well, I'm going through that at the moment, actually, and thinking about the structure for our this new business venture. I am doing it with my sister because she has run franchise businesses before. But I am thinking about whether we bring on a chef or someone from the food trade as well. I think the thing to be really careful about is work with those people for a while first before you formally commit, if you can, because you do need to have a really strong working relationship and need to be able to work well with those people. So it's really important to work that out. I think be really clear about expectations about equity or structure or sort of what people are putting in and what they're getting out in return. And if you do formalise it, or when you do formalise it, there are some mechanisms that you should be aware of and make sure you put in place, like vesting periods and a cliff in terms of how long they need to be in the business before they actually get that equity recognised.
Sure.
So speak to a decent lawyer, basically.
And avoid those sharks that are circling that industry.
Yeah. There's some really great people around. You just, take recommendations, definitely. It's in the startup scene, it's really important to build your network and everyone knows each other in a small city like Sydney anyway. So,
for sure.
Yeah, it's well worth taking on recommendations.
Sounds good. And so obviously it doesn't even have a name yet, so it probably doesn't have a website, but is there any details for people that want to hunt down what you're doing later on that you can share? Maybe not even anything?
Unfortunately, no, not at this point. I guess if nothing else, then follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn.
Twitter handle?
Just Faith Forster, and LinkedIn. You'll generally
Search
find me.
Faith Forster.
Yeah, find me under the same name. I'll probably be posting about it there.
Fantastic. Well, it has been a sensational discussion, Faith Forster. I've really appreciated your time.
Thank you. I appreciate the interview.
Thank you. There you have it. I hope you really enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please like it, share it, or leave us a review on your favourite platform. It helps us show more of this content to people just like you.